$25. That was the sum, counted twice across a walnut desk by a man who shared her blood, but not her name, on any document that mattered, and it was meant to be the end of her story before it had properly begun. She was 21 years old, standing in a hallway that had once been her father's, holding a satchel that held everything she now owned, and a brass surveyor's level wrapped in oilcloth that owned, in its way, her. She would ride out that same week, toward a mountain pass that no map bothered to name anymore, toward a wagon that had been wrecked and abandoned there for 10 years, wedged between two boulders like a tooth that would not come loose, a thing every freighter and rancher and railroad clerk in 3 counties had already decided was worthless. She would climb inside it with nothing but a chisel, a lantern, and the patient, particular way of looking at the world her father had spent a boyhood's worth of Sundays teaching her. And beneath a false floor she was not even certain existed until her hands found the seam, she would find the paper that turned $25 into something else entirely. But that comes later. Stay with her a moment first, in the hallway, in the cold arithmetic of that Tuesday morning, because the woman who would later stand in a railroad engineer's office and refuse to be grateful for less than she was owed was not born there. She was made, slowly, years before, by a man with grease under his fingernails and chalk lines on his boots, who believed a daughter could learn grade and elevation, as well as any son the company articles might have preferred. This is a story about what gets written down and what does not, about deeds and ledgers, and the particular cruelty of a man who is not cruel at all, only correct, only following the letter of a document her father never thought to amend. It is about a brass instrument that outlived the man who carried it, and a road through a mountain pass that the whole world had agreed to forget, right up until it became the only road anyone needed. If you have found your way to this fire before, you know how these stories go, slow and true, and worth the waiting. If this is your first time settling in, welcome. Tell us, before we go any further, where you are listening from tonight, what town, what porch, what quiet hour you have carved out for this. Then let yourself sit back, because to understand what she found in that wrecked wagon, you must first understand what she lost, years before, in a house that smelled of pine resin and lamp oil, where a man taught his daughter to read the land the way other fathers taught their sons to read scripture. The house stood at the edge of a freighting depot in a valley town, whose name mattered less than its weather, which was dry 9 months of the year, and bitter the other 3. And the man who raised her there had hands permanently stained at the knuckle with the graphite of pencils worn down to nubs, because a road surveyor in that country carried his tools the way a preacher carried his book, and used them just as often. He was not a large man, nor a loud one. He measured his words the way he measured grade, carefully, and only after looking twice. In the evenings he sat at a table scarred with compass-point circles and taught her, without ceremony, the things he knew, how a stream cuts the path a road should follow before any man surveys it, how 10 feet of elevation gained too quickly will break the back of a mule team and the patience of a driver both, how a toll agreement written badly is worse than no agreement at all, because it gives men something to argue over instead of something to honor. She was 7 the first time he set the brass level in her hands and told her to find level ground, and 11 the first time she found it faster than he did, and he did not praise her extravagantly for it. He simply nodded, once, the way he nodded at a bridge that held, and said that a person who could read the land honestly would never go hungry in a country that lied about everything else. That was the whole of his philosophy, delivered in increments, over years, in a voice that never rose. Her mother had died of a fever when she was 4, too early to leave more than the outline of a memory, a hum of a hymn, the smell of lavender water, and so it was her father who raised her, alone, without complaint, in a house that always smelled faintly of pine resin, from the shelves he built himself, and lamp oil from the nights he worked past dark, over survey plats spread across the table, like a second, private scripture. He never remarried. He never explained why. He simply worked, and taught, and kept a ledger of toll agreements with mountain landowners in a hand so precise that men later called it suspicious, as though honesty itself were a kind of trick. The brass level he gave her outright on her 16th birthday, setting it in her palms with both of his hands wrapped around hers for a moment longer than necessary, and told her that a tool like that, cared for, would outlast the man who bought it, which turned out, in the end, to be truer than either of them intended, and sooner. He taught her the level, the way other fathers taught their daughters to keep house, which is to say patiently, and without once suggesting there was anything unusual in it. She learned to set the tripod on uneven ground so the bubble found its center within a breath, to sight along the telescope and call out numbers in a voice as flat and certain as his own, to read a stretch of mountain road the way a banker read a column of figures, not as scenery, but as fact. He would walk ahead of her along the survey lines with his coat collar turned up against the wind, and she would follow with the rod held steady, and between them they built a kind of language made of grades and stations and elevations that no one else in the house, had there been anyone else, would have understood. It was on one of those walks, in the autumn she turned 14, that he first told her about the pass, a narrow cut through the mountains 2 days' ride from the house, where the freight road climbed steep enough to break an axle if a driver misjudged the grade, and where he had spent the better part of a summer, years before she was born, negotiating with 3 landowners for the right to keep that road open in perpetuity. He spoke of it the way other men spoke of a marriage or a debt settled, with a kind of quiet finality, and told her that the deed for it was filed away safe, though he never said precisely where, only that a document like that was worth more than the ground it described, because ground could be walked around, but a right-of-way, once secured, could not be taken from a man, except by force or forgetting. She had not thought of that conversation in years. It surfaced now, riding north with $25 folded into her boot, and the brass level wrapped in oilcloth against her chest, the way a half-remembered hymn surfaces at a funeral, uninvited, and exactly on time. The land changed as she rode, the grass giving way to sage, the sage giving way to bare red rock that held the afternoon heat, long after the sun had begun its slow retreat toward the western ridgeline. She passed no other travelers that first day, only the wide indifferent sky and the occasional hawk circling something she could not see. She thought, more than once, about turning back toward town to ask her cousin plainly where the old survey papers had gone, and each time she thought of the ledger closing without a sound, of the exact sum counted onto the table, and she kept riding instead, because there was nothing behind her worth the asking. By the second evening, the mountains that had been a blue suggestion on the horizon had become a wall, and somewhere within them, she knew, lay the pass her father had once measured with his own hands and never lived to see again. She made camp that second night in a shallow wash where the rock still held a memory of the day's heat, and she did not build the fire tall, because a tall fire spoke of a traveler who did not know better, and she had been taught better. She had been taught, in fact, a great many things about how a person survived alone, in country that did not care whether she lived or did not, and she catalogued them now the way her father had once catalogued elevations, one figure set down carefully after another. Keep the fire low, keep the level dry, keep the mind on the next mile and not on the ledger, and not on the cousin's face, which had shown nothing at all, which was somehow worse than if it had shown contempt. She ate a strip of dried beef and half a biscuit she had carried from the boarding-house kitchen, wrapped in a handkerchief that had been her mother's, and she drank sparingly from the canteen, because she did not yet know where the next water was, only that her father's old notes, the ones she carried in memory rather than on paper, since the paper notes were the very thing that had vanished from the company office, placed a spring some 6 miles further along the base of the range, if the range had not shifted in 9 years, which ranges, she reminded herself, did not do. The wind came down off the peaks sometime after midnight and pressed against the canvas she had rigged between 2 boulders, and she lay awake listening to it, not from fear exactly, but from the particular alertness of a person with very little left to lose, and therefore a great deal to protect. She thought of her father's hands closing the brass level's case each evening, the small click of the latch, the way he would hold it up to catch the last light before folding it away, as if bidding it good night. She thought of the toll agreements he used to speak of only in passing, offhand remarks over supper about landowners in the high passes who had signed their names to arrangements nobody in town seemed to remember or care about anymore, arrangements that had once made the family's freighting line the only one worth trusting on 3 separate mountain roads. She had not thought of those remarks in years. She thought of them now with the same uninvited clarity as the ledger, as the hymn. By morning, the wind had dropped, and the light came up pale gold over the ridgeline, and she broke camp before the cold had fully left the air, coiling her bedroll with hands that moved from long habit rather than any particular resolve. She checked the level once more, turning it over in the oilcloth, running her thumb along the seam of the case the way she might once have checked a door was locked. Then she mounted and turned the horse's head toward the notch in the rock wall that her father, in the last clear year of his life, had called simply the Gap, the place, he had said, where the whole country narrowed to a single sensible road. The Gap did not announce itself the way she had expected. There was no dramatic narrowing of the trail, no sudden wall of stone rising up to swallow the sky. Instead, the country simply folded inward, one ridge leaning toward its neighbor, until the space between them was barely wide enough for a wagon and team, and even that, only if the driver knew precisely where the ground held firm beneath the loose shale. She reined in at the mouth of it and sat for a long moment, letting the horse blow, letting her own breath settle into something less than the shallow, quickened thing it had become. She had heard of the wreck the way most people in the territory had heard of it, a story told sideways, half joke and half warning, about a freighting outfit 10 years gone that had tried the pass too late in the season and lost a wagon to a rock slide that nobody had bothered to clear because the rail spur further south had already made the road obsolete. Men who told the story never agreed on the details. Some said the team had gone over with the wagon. Some said only the wagon had gone, wedged sideways between 2 boulders where it had sat ever since, stripped of anything worth carrying off, left to weather into the color of the stone around it. Nobody claimed to know whose wagon it had been. Nobody, she suspected, had thought to ask. She knew. She had known since the ledger, since the offhand remarks come back to her whole and sharp in the middle of the night, since the ache of recognition that had kept her from sleep more than the cold had. The freighting line's oldest routes had run through exactly 3 high passes, and this was the last of them, the one her father had called simply the Gap, the one he had surveyed himself in the years before her mother died, when he had still believed the company would belong to more than a ledger and a distant cousin's arithmetic. She walked the horse in at a slow pace, letting her eyes adjust to the deeper shadow between the rock walls, letting the level in its oilcloth case knock gently against her hip with each step, a small hard reminder of the one lesson that had never left her. Grade, elevation, the narrow places where a road either worked or it did not, where a man's whole fortune could turn on whether he had measured correctly or only guessed. The wreck came into view before she was ready for it, though she had been watching for it the whole way. A shape too regular to be stone, canted hard to one side, one wheel gone entirely, and the axle sunk into 10 years of settled dust, the canvas long since rotted away to gray threads that moved faintly, even in air she could not feel moving. She stopped the horse a dozen yards off and sat looking at it the way a person looks at a grave they have traveled a long way to find. She sat there longer than she meant to, long enough that the horse shifted its weight twice and blew air through its nose in mild complaint, long enough that a hawk crossed the strip of sky between the rock walls and was gone again before she had finished looking at the wagon's broken spine. 10 years the pass had kept it, 10 years of summer heat cracking the wood, and winter frost working into the cracks, 10 years of nothing passing through but weather and the occasional animal, and still the shape of it was unmistakably her father's kind of thing. Built heavy, built low, built by a man who had priced lumber against grade, the way other men priced whiskey against thirst. She had heard him talk about wagons the way some men talked about horses, as though each one had a temperament, a way of failing that could be predicted if a person only paid attention early enough. She dismounted at last and led the horse the remaining distance on foot, because the ground here was uncertain, littered with rock that had come down from somewhere above, sometime in the years since anyone had last cleared it, and because she found she did not want to arrive at the wreck any faster than she had to. There was a way of approaching a dead thing that her father had also taught her, without ever saying so directly, the way he approached a washed-out grade, or a bridge gone soft in the timbers, slow, circling, letting the whole shape of the trouble show itself before he touched anything. She circled the wagon now. The remaining wheel had rotted at the felloe and looked as though a strong wind might finish what 10 years had not. The tongue lay half buried, pointing back the way the wagon had come, toward the old road, and the toll gate that no longer stood, toward a town that had shrunk to nothing once the rails went elsewhere. She crouched at the tailgate, where the wood was split enough to show the dark interior, and for a moment did not reach in. She thought of her cousin's ledger, the neat black figures, the $25 folded into her palm without a word of apology, because none had seemed necessary to him. She thought of her father saying, more than once, that a road was only worthless, to the man who did not know what lay beneath it. Then she reached in, past a decade of dust and the brittle remains of a canvas sack. Her fingers, finding the seam of the wagon bed before her eyes had adjusted enough to see it, a seam too straight, too deliberate, to belong to any ordinary floor. The seam ran the width of the wagon bed, hidden beneath a skin of grime so old it had become part of the wood itself. She pressed a thumbnail into it. It held, then gave, the way a drawer gives when a house has settled crooked around it. She did not pull at it yet. She made herself stop, the way her father had made her stop 100 times on a hillside when she wanted to run straight at an answer instead of walking the grade first. "Look before you dig," he used to say. "The ground lies to men in a hurry." She sat back on her heels in the dirt and studied the seam from a distance of 2 feet, the way she would study a survey line before trusting it. It ran parallel to the wagon's axle, not to its walls, which meant whoever had cut it had thought in terms of weight distribution, not carpentry. That was not the work of a careless freighter patching a floor. That was the work of a man thinking like her father thought, in loads, in balance, in what a wheel could bear before it broke. The wind picked up along the pass, carrying grit that stung the backs of her hands, and somewhere above her, a hawk complained once and let the current take it east. She listened to the sound fade before she reached in again. This time she worked her fingers along the full length of the seam, feeling for a catch, a peg, anything a man might have left himself to lift the board again later. Near the tailgate end, her nail caught a groove no wider than a knife's edge. She traced it upward, found where it turned, found where a second groove crossed it, an L, cut deliberate and clean, meant to be found by touch in the dark, by someone who already knew it was there. Her chest went tight in a way she did not examine. She pressed her palm flat against the board and pushed toward the wagon's front end, the direction the L pointed. The wood groaned, resisted, then slid half an inch with a sound like a held breath finally let out. Dust sifted down into her sleeve. She stopped again, made herself breathe, made herself remember that 10 years of heat and cold could have warped anything into looking like intention when it was only rot. But rot did not carve an L. She looked down the length of the pass, empty in both directions, the old road running crooked toward a horizon that had swallowed the town whole. No one was coming. No one had come this way in years. Whatever was beneath that board had been waiting the entire time for someone who knew enough to look at a seam and see a decision instead of an accident. She pushed the board the rest of the way, and it slid free into her hands, lighter than she expected, and beneath it, the dark opened up like a mouth that had been holding something back for a very long time. She did not reach in at once. Her hand hovered above the opening, the way it had hovered above her father's ledgers as a child, taught to look before touching, to let the eyes do the first work, so the fingers would not disturb what the eyes had not yet understood. The space beneath the board was shallow, no deeper than a bread box, lined with what had once been oilcloth, and was now a stiff brown husk that crackled when the wind found it. She could see the corner of something flat. Paper, she thought, or leather, pressed so long under the weight of that board that it had taken the board's own shape, a rectangle with rounded edges gone soft with damp and dry again, 100 times over. She thought of her father's hands sorting through the strongbox at the kitchen table, always the same order, deed, then note, then the smaller papers beneath, and she found herself sorting the dark the same way, before she had touched a single thing, as if his patience had settled into her fingers years ago and only now had reason to surface. The wind picked up along the pass, carrying grit that ticked against the wagon's ribs, and somewhere below, a hawk called once and did not call again. She reached in. The oilcloth resisted, glued to itself at the folds, and she worked it loose the way she had once worked frozen harness leather back to suppleness in the barn, warming it first with her palms, though there was no cold here to warm against, only 10 years of stillness that had made the material forget it was ever meant to bend. It gave at last, with a sound like a page turning in a very large book. Beneath it lay a folded document, its creases gone white and brittle, and beside it, wrapped separately in a scrap of oilcloth all its own, something smaller and harder, a shape she recognized before she understood why, because her thumb had traced that same shape 1,000 times on a chain around her father's neck. She did not unfold the paper yet. She held both things against her chest instead, the way a person holds something before they are ready to know what it costs them to know it, and she looked out again at the empty pass, at the road running crooked toward the swallowed town, at the sky beginning to lean gold as the afternoon wore down toward evening. Whoever had built this hiding place had built it to survive exactly this, a stranger's curious hand, 10 years later, in a wagon everyone else had walked past, and called worthless. She thought of her cousin's ledger, and his $25 counted twice, and something in her chest that had been clenched since that Tuesday loosened by one small measure, though she could not yet say why, because she had not yet unfolded the paper resting against her ribs like a held breath of its own. The small, hard shape she set first on her knee, unwrapping the oilcloth with fingers that had gone unsteady, in a way they had not been unsteady even when the wagon's floorboard had first come loose beneath her pry bar. It was a button. Not a button of any ordinary kind, but a surveyor's chain button, brass gone the color of weak tea, stamped along its rim with the mark of the instrument maker in Wheeling, who had made her father's level, the same mark she had traced with her own thumbnail 100 times, while he explained to her, patiently, the way he explained everything, that a good chain was only as honest as the man who read it. He had worn one just like it on his coat, always, through every season, through every survey, from the Cumberland Gap to this pass and beyond it. She had assumed it buried with him, or lost, or simply worn away, the way small things wear away from a life. She had not known there was a second. She turned it over. On its reverse, scratched by hand, not stamped, were 2 letters and a date, and the date was 11 years past. A full year before she remembered him surveying this very grade with his chain, and his level, and his patient voice, telling her to sight the far stake twice before she trusted the first reading. She sat very still with that knowledge settling into her the way water settles into dry ground, slow and complete and impossible to call back out again. Then, because the button had steadied her more than frightened her, she unfolded the paper. It was smaller than she had expected, folded in eighths, the creases gone soft and pale from handling long before the wagon had ever crashed. The ink had browned, but had not failed. It was a legal hand, careful, the kind of hand a clerk uses when he intends a document to outlive him, and across the top, in letters she read twice because the first reading did not seem possible, ran words she had not thought to look for in a wrecked freight wagon at the bottom of an abandoned pass. A grant, a deed, a description of boundaries measured in chains and rods and stakes she recognized from her father's own notebooks, running along the very shelf of rock where she now sat. She read her father's name at the bottom of it, and beneath that, in a hand she did not know, a second name, and a seal pressed faint, but unbroken, into the old paper's corner. The gold light kept sliding lower across the pass while she read, and she did not notice it going, because for the first time since the Tuesday morning in her cousin's office, she was not thinking about $25 at all. She read it a third time, slower now, tracing the surveyor's language with the tip of her finger, the way her father used to trace a line on a map before he trusted it, and the boundaries described in that brittle hand, matched, chain for chain, the notations she had copied 1,000 times into her own hand, from his notebooks by lamplight, when she was a girl of 11 who thought the work was only a game he played with her, because her mother had died, and someone needed to keep her occupied on the long evenings. It had never occurred to her that the game had a purpose beyond itself. It had never occurred to her that the columns of figures, the compass bearings, The elevations noted in his small, cramped writing were not exercises but a record of something he intended to hold on to. The document named a rite of passage. Not a claim to timber, not a claim to water, not a claim to any ore that might lie beneath the rock. A rite of passage, granted in perpetuity, to any wagon, cart, or conveyance, bearing the name written at the bottom of the page, across the only usable grade through the pass. She had read enough of her father's contracts, copied enough of them into fair hand for his files, to know what perpetuity meant to a lawyer, and what it meant to the men who paid to cross land that was not theirs. It meant the grant did not die with the man who signed it. It meant it did not die with the wagon that carried it, wrecked or not. It meant, unless someone had filed a paper somewhere she did not yet know to look, that it had been sitting folded in this false floor for 10 years, waiting, indifferent to whether anyone remembered it existed. She sat very still on the rock shelf with the deed open across her knees, and the wind that had followed her up through the pass since morning seemed, for a moment, to have gone quiet with her. Somewhere below, her horse shifted its weight against its tether, and a stone clattered down the scree, and the sound reached her as if from a great distance, the way sounds reach a person surfacing slowly from water. She thought of her cousin's office, the $25 counted out on the desk, the ledger closed without a tremor in his hand. She thought of him saying the company owed her nothing, and how easily, how correctly, by every article and clause he had shown her, he had believed that to be true. He had not known about the false floor. He had not known, because the wagon had been counted worthless the day it crashed, and no one troubles to search the floorboards of a thing already declared to be nothing. She folded the deed along its old creases, carefully, the way a person folds a thing they intend to unfold many more times before they are finished with it, and looked down the long grade toward the place where the rail survey stakes, new and pale and utterly unaware of what she now held, marched off toward the horizon. She did not move for a long while, and the stillness was not idleness but arithmetic. Her father had taught her that a survey stake meant nothing on its own, that a man could drive 100 stakes into good ground and 100 more into bad, and the paper would not tell the difference until someone walked the line between them with a level and a chain and an honest eye. She had that eye now, whether anyone in the territory believed a woman could carry one. She lifted the brass level from her satchel, the same instrument her father had set on a tripod in 100 fields, while she stood beside him holding the rod steady against the wind, and she began, stake by stake, to walk the grade the rail company had marked, matching its pale wooden teeth against the boundary lines, written in her father's careful hand, on the deed now folded inside her coat. The first stake sat exactly 9 rods from the northern boundary he had drawn 30 years before. By the 4th stake she was no longer surprised, only quiet in the particular way a person goes quiet when a suspicion hardens into fact, and she noted the elevation at each point in the small ledger book she carried, the numbers falling into place with the plainness of things that had always been true and were only now being looked at. The rail company's engineers, whoever they were, had done careful work. They had found the only grade through that country gentle enough to lay track upon, the same grade her father had found decades earlier, riding a mule with a chain and a compass, and no one to tell him it mattered. They had simply not troubled to ask who owned it, because the deed had been filed in a county courthouse 200 miles away and forgotten in a drawer, and because a wrecked wagon wedged in rock had told everyone who passed that there was nothing here worth owning. She sat back on her heels and looked at the pass in the flattening afternoon light, at the burned wood and the rusted iron and the pale new stakes marching through it all with such confidence, and she felt something settle in her chest that was not triumph, not yet, but was close enough to be its cousin. Her cousin's ledger had closed on $25. This ledger, the one she was building line by line in a notebook with a pencil worn down to a stub, would not close so easily, and she intended that it should not. She thought of the survey crew that would come up this grade within the month, of the foreman who would find the pass already claimed, and of the look that would cross his face when a woman rode down to meet him holding a deed older than the railroad itself. She did not ride down that same afternoon, though the wanting of it sat in her like a struck bell that would not quiet. Her father had taught her that the surest way to lose a negotiation was to arrive at it hungry, and she was hungry in more ways than one, for food, for rest, for the plain animal comfort of being believed, and so she made herself wait. She rode back down through the pass, as the light went the color of a ripe peach along the western rock, and she made camp again near the wagon, and she spent that evening not resting but working, spreading the deed flat on a board across her knees, and copying its language into her notebook in her own hand, word for word, boundary marker for boundary marker, so that if the original paper were lost to fire, or flood, or simple bad luck, she would still carry its meaning intact inside her own skull. She checked her figures against her father's old traverse notes 3 times, the way he had taught her to check a bridge abutment 3 times, before trusting a wagon's weight to it, because a mistake caught on paper cost only pride, while a mistake caught in the field could cost a man his life, or in her case, could cost her the one thing standing between her and a return to a life of counted-out sums and closed ledgers. The mules cropped at the thin grass along the stream bed, and the fire burned low and orange against the dark, and somewhere up the slope a nightjar called twice and went silent, and she found herself talking to her father in the particular quiet way she had done since his burial, not aloud, not even in words exactly, but in the steady internal report she gave him of what she had found and what she meant to do with it, as though he were still capable of correcting her arithmetic. She thought he would have told her to move carefully. She thought he would also have told her, in that dry way he had, that carefully did not mean slowly, and that a road left unclaimed too long had a way of growing new owners, the way a fence line left untended grew new fence posts, driven by other men with other papers. By the time the fire had burned to coals, she had decided on her order of operations, the way she might once have decided on the order of a survey line. First the courthouse, to have the deeds standing confirmed and copied under seal before she showed it to anyone with money enough to dispute it. Then the pass itself, to run her own elevations against the railroad stakes and prove with her own numbers what the deed only implied, and only then, with both paper and proof in hand, the foreman, and whatever came after the foreman. She banked the fire and lay back against her saddle with the level's brass case cool beneath her fingers, and above her the stars came out over the pass in their old indifferent order, unconcerned with deeds or railroads, or the small determined woman lying beneath them, already awake in her mind for the ride to the county seat at first light. The county seat announced itself the way such towns always did, by smell before sight, coal smoke and horse dung, and the particular hot tin odor of a courthouse roof baking under a sun that had climbed high and white by the time she rode in, her mare's hooves striking the packed clay of the main street with a sound that seemed, to her, louder than it had any right to be. She had slept perhaps 4 hours. She had eaten cold biscuit and river water, and had not stopped once on the ride down, not even where the trail crossed a spring she remembered from childhood, because she had learned by then that stopping was a luxury bought with time she no longer had, and she had none to spend. The recorder of deeds was a narrow man, with ink-stained cuffs, and the unhurried manner of someone who had spent 30 years watching other people's urgency break itself against his counter. He took the deed from her with 2 fingers, the way a man handles something he suspects may be either very valuable or entirely worthless, and has not yet decided which, and he read it twice, and the second time his eyebrows moved, very slightly, in a way she chose to read as promising. He asked her father's name. She gave it. He asked when the deed had been recorded, and she told him the year, and he disappeared into a back room, lined floor to ceiling, with ledgers bound in cracked leather, the kind of room that smelled of dust and mouse nest and old paper going soft at the corners, and he was gone long enough that she began, despite the discipline of her order of operations, to worry. When he came back, he carried a second book, older than the first, its spine broken and mended with wax thread, and he opened it on the counter between them and turned it so she could read it herself rather than take his word, which she noted and approved of, even in her impatience. There it was, her father's name, in a clerk's careful hand faded to the color of weak tea, entered against the same section and range the deed named, the same year, the same witness signatures she had already memorized by firelight. Confirmed, standing, on the county's own books, undisturbed by 10 years of dust and 1 abandoned wagon, and a railroad that had built its stakes across land it did not, in the strict and recorded fact of the matter, own. She asked for a certified copy, and paid for it from the money she had left, and did not let herself smile until she was back outside on the courthouse steps, with the paper folded inside her coat, next to the original, both of them now doubly hers, doubly proven, and the mare waiting patient in the shade, with her head down and one hip cocked, and the pass still 40 miles distant, and the railroad stakes still standing, wherever the foreman's men had driven them, waiting for someone with numbers of her own to prove them wrong. The ride back toward the pass took the better part of 2 days, and she spent both of them the way her father had taught her to spend any long stretch of empty time in the saddle, not idle, never idle, but turning the problem over, the way a man turns a stone to see what crawls beneath it. She had the deed. She had the county's own confirmation of the deed, sealed and certified and folded now in oilcloth against the damp. What she did not yet have was the thing that would make a railroad company sit still long enough to read either one. She had watched her father argue boundary disputes before county commissioners who wanted, above all else, to be somewhere else. Paper alone never moved men like that. Paper was words, and words could be doubted, reinterpreted, quietly buried in a drawer until the season changed and the problem solved itself by attrition. What moved men like that was a number they could not argue with, set down in a hand they trusted, showing them a fact about the earth itself that no clerk's signature could contradict. So on the second evening, camped where the trail bent up toward the first switchback below the pass, she unpacked the level from its case and set it on its tripod on a flat shelf of rock, and did not sleep until she had run the grade herself, station by station, from the wash below the wreck to the lip of the notch where the old road crested and dropped toward the valley on the far side. She worked by lamplight for the last of it, her father's notebook open beside her, his figures from years past penciled faint in the margins where she had copied them as a girl without understanding why they mattered. Now she understood. Every reading she took tonight matched, within inches, the readings he had taken a decade before her, the numbers agreeing across 10 years and 1 death, as though the mountain itself had simply been waiting, patient as bedrock, for someone to ask it the same question twice. She wrote it all down again in her own hand, clean and square, the way he had drilled her to write it. Never trust memory, he used to say. Memory forgives itself, paper does not. And by the time she banked the fire and lay down with her coat for a blanket, she had 3 things now instead of 1. The deed that said the road was hers, the county's confirmation that said the deed was true, and a survey of her own making that said the grade could carry no other line but this one, not without cost, the railroad would not willingly bear. She lay a long while looking up at a sky gone hard and bright with stars, thinking not of the wagon or the wreck or the money still owed her, but of a man, bent over a tripod on a cold morning years gone, telling a girl too young to know she was being given anything at all that the land does not lie. Only men do, and a person who can read the land correctly need never be at the mercy of a man who cannot. She woke before the sun did, the way she had woken every morning since her father first strapped her wrists to the discipline of dawn, and she did not linger in the waking. There was a particular cold that came off the rock in that hour, a cold that lived under the skin of the night's warmth and waited only for the fire to die before it climbed up out of the ground. And she had learned as a girl not to fight it, but to move through it, to let the work warm her instead of the blanket. She rolled the papers into the oilskin her father had once used for exactly this purpose, tied it with the same knot he had shown her twice before trusting her to tie it once, and she ate what remained of yesterday's bread standing up, looking east toward the pass mouth where the light was only a suggestion yet, a paling at the rim of the dark. She had decided in the night, in that long while of looking at the stars and thinking of tripods and cold mornings, that she would not wait for the railroad to come to her. That had been her cousin's error, she thought. Not the wanting, not even the manner of the wanting, but the waiting, the assumption that a claim announced itself, that paper alone did the labor of persuasion. Her father had never surveyed a road by sitting still and hoping the land would explain itself to a man too impatient to walk it twice. He had walked it 3 times, 4, until the numbers stopped arguing with each other. She meant to do the same with people. So she saddled the mare in the gray light, packed the level with the same care she gave the papers, and turned not back down toward the town where her cousin waited on an answer he did not yet know was already decided, but up toward the rail camp itself, where the survey crews had pitched their tents along the old grade the company had scraped out before abandoning it for a route that cost more in iron than it saved in labor. She had heard the foreman's name twice now, spoken with a kind of weary respect by men who did not respect much. A man named for his caution, they said, a man who did not sign what he had not walked. She meant to make him walk it. The mare picked her way over ground still cold and hard with the last of the season's frost, and Susanna rode with the oilskin bundle against her chest, like something warm, like something alive, and she found she was not afraid, not the way she had been afraid on the first morning she rode into this pass with $25 and a dead man's instrument for company. She was something else now, something she did not yet have a word for, though she suspected the word, when it came, would sound a good deal like her father's voice. The camp announced itself before it came into view, the way frontier camps always did, with the smell of wood smoke and boiled coffee, and the particular tang of hot iron being worked somewhere just out of sight. She counted 11 tents from the ridge, and beyond them the raw scar of the abandoned grade running east like a wound the mountain had not yet finished healing over. Men moved among the canvas with the unhurried purpose of people who had been paid to wait, which she understood now was its own kind of labor, harder in its way than digging. She found the foreman by his boots before she found him by his face. Good boots, wrestled twice, the kind a man kept because he trusted his own judgment about what was worth keeping. He was crouched over a set of chain and stake markings laid out on a canvas sheet, and he did not look up when her shadow crossed the paper, only said, "If you're selling something, I've already got a cook and a farrier." "I'm not selling," she said. "I'm proving." That brought his eyes up. They were pale and unhurried, the eyes of a man who had learned young that most claims did not survive a second look, and so he had stopped granting first looks easily. She saw him take in the mare, the oilskin bundle, the brass case slung across her shoulder, with its leather strap worn soft and dark, from a decade of another hand's carrying. "Proving what?" "That the grade you scraped and left was the only one that will hold your rail without 3 more years of blasting you don't have money for." She crouched, uninvited, and set the level on the canvas beside his chain markings. "And that the pass is already deeded, has been for 11 years, to my father's name, which is now mine." He did not laugh, which she had half expected, and he did not dismiss her, which she had hoped for, without quite believing it would come. He simply looked at the level for a long moment, at the maker's stamp on its brass, at the wear along its edges that only came from use, real use, years of it, and something in his face shifted the way ground shifts before it settles into a new configuration. "Walk it with me," he said. "Not the deed, the grade. I want to see what you see before I look at a single paper." "Now?" Frost won't hold past noon. He was already standing, already reaching for a coil of chain and a bundle of stakes, moving with the flat economy of a man who had learned not to waste steps. "You said proving. Prove it walking." She rose, and felt the cold air fill her chest like something clean, and understood that whatever came next would not be decided by the paper folded against her heart. Not yet, not until the ground itself had spoken first. They went out through the yard where the frost still lay unbroken in the shadow of the station house, silver and undisturbed, and she noted, the way her father had taught her to note such things without being asked, that the sun had not yet cleared the eastern ridge, and would not for the better part of an hour, which meant the light they walked in now was the same flat, shadowless light in which grade could be read most honestly, before the afternoon slant began lying to the eye, the way it lied to every surveyor who trusted appearance over instrument. He noticed her noticing. She saw him notice. They climbed the old grade in silence, past the place where the rail bed broke off into unfinished rubble, past the stakes some earlier crew had driven and abandoned when the survey had gone bad 2 winters running, and she counted her paces without meaning to, the old habit surfacing the way a hand finds a doorframe in the dark, and when they reached the first true rise she stopped without being told to stop and said, "Here." Just that. He set the chain. She called the elevation before he read it off the level, and when he read it off the level, It matched hers within an inch, and he said nothing, only moved the stakes forward and set the chain again, and again. She called the number before he did, and again it held, and by the fourth station, his jaw had gone tight, in the particular way of a man revising an opinion he had not intended to revise so early in the day. Your father teach you the chain, or the level? Both. He said a man who trusts only one instrument is a man who has never watched an instrument lie. He almost smiled. Did not. Quite. Mine used to say the same, near enough. They worked the grade for the better part of 2 hours, and she felt the cold burn off her hands and settle instead into a kind of clean fatigue, the good kind, the kind that came from being useful in a way that could be measured. And somewhere in the third hour, she understood that he had stopped testing her and started simply working alongside her, the two of them moving up the old wrecked pass, the way two men of the same trade moved. Without ceremony, without unnecessary words, chain and stake and sight and call, chain and stake and sight and call, until the sun cleared the ridge at last, and the frost began to give at the edges of the trail, and he straightened, and looked back down the grade they had climbed, and said, not to her exactly, more to the ground itself, nobody's walked this proper since before the wreck. Someone has now, she said. He looked at her a moment longer than the words required, and then he reached for his coat pocket, where she had seen, folded twice, a paper of his own. It was the railroad's own preliminary survey she saw, folded soft at the creases from having been carried and unfolded, and carried again, the ink gone faint blue-gray, the way ink goes when it has traveled through a man's coat, across seasons of weather, and he held it out to her without ceremony, the way her father used to hand her a chain, to check rather than explain what needed checking. Company's grade, he said, the one they mean to cut if this pass proves out unworkable. She took it in both hands, the paper stiff with old folding, and she read it the way her father had taught her to read any document that claimed to describe land, not for what it said outright, but for what it assumed, what it left silent, the places where a surveyor's confidence thinned into guesswork. The alternate grade ran 2 miles east, through a saddle she had never walked but whose contour she recognized from the government maps at the land office, a saddle that climbed sharper than this one, that would require, by her own rough figuring, nearly twice the cut and twice the trestle work. This would cost them, she said. More than they've let on, he said. More than the district office knows, I'd guess, since the district office hasn't sat a horse out here in 11 months. She folded the paper back along its own creases, careful of them, and handed it to him, and he took it and did not put it away, only held it loose at his side, as though it had become, in the last minute, a different kind of paper than it had been that morning. Why show me, she said. He considered the question longer than she expected, looking off down the pass toward the wagon's rusted iron, gone gold now in the full morning light, and when he answered it was without warmth and without coldness either, the way a man states a fact he has only just finished believing. Because you've walked more of this grade in 3 hours than any man the company's sent in 3 years, he said, and because, if I take a false report back down that mountain, it'll be my name on it, not theirs, when the truth comes out later, the way it always does. He said it plainly, the way her father had once said that a bad grade will show itself eventually, whether a man reports it honest or not, and she stood there, in the thinning frost, with the sun now full, on the wrecked iron below them, and understood that the conversation they were about to have was not the one she had ridden up expecting. She folded the deed back along its old creases, careful of the corner that had softened to felt from 10 years pressed beneath a wagon floor, and she did not hand it to him, though she let him see that she was not hiding it either. That was a distinction her father had taught her without ever saying so directly, in the way he had once shown a landowner a toll ledger across a fence rail and let the man read the figures upside down rather than turn the book around. Trust offered in small, exact portions, never given away whole. The engineer watched her do it, and something in his face eased, not into friendliness, but into the particular relief of a man who has been spared the trouble of deciding whether to trust a stranger, because the stranger has decided it for him. You'll want to see the grade stakes I drove above the second switchback, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had expected it to. steadier than it had any right to after 3 hours of climbing in cold that had only just now begun to lift. "The company's survey has the elevation wrong by 11 feet at the Narrows. I can show you where." He looked at her the way her cousin never had, not measuring her against what she was owed, but against what she knew. And he said, "Show me." And there was nothing more to it than that. No ceremony. No admission of what it cost him to say it to a woman standing in a wash, in a canvas coat, with a dead man's level slung over her shoulder. They walked together back down toward the wreck, past the ribs of the old wagon bleaching in the strengthening light, and she found herself narrating the grade the way her father used to narrate weather, in short, plain sentences meant to be believed rather than admired, and the engineer listened with the particular attention of a man checking her figures against his own, without letting her see him doing it. At the Narrows, she set the level on its makeshift tripod and had him sight through it himself, and watched his jaw tighten slightly at what the bubble told him, and she understood, standing there in the cold, with the sun climbing over the rimrock, that the 11 feet were no longer an argument she would need to win. They were simply true. The way her father had always said, the land itself did not care who owned the paper, only who could read it correctly, and for the first time since she had ridden into the pass, she let herself believe that the reading might, after all, belong to her. The engineer straightened from the level slowly, the way a man straightens after admitting something to himself he had not planned to admit before witnesses, and he folded his hands behind his back and looked down the Narrows for a long moment without speaking. She did not fill the silence. Her father had taught her that too, years before, standing over a chain and stake on a survey outside Prescott, telling her that the man who spoke first after the numbers were shown was always the man asking for something, and she did not intend to be that man this morning. He asked, finally, whether the deed was recorded in the county seat or only carried on her person, and she told him plainly that it was recorded, had been recorded for 11 years, filed by her father's own hand, in a leather-bound register that any clerk with a lamp and an hour could confirm, and that she had ridden 2 days out of her way the previous autumn to make certain of it herself before she had ever set foot back in the pass. He nodded at that, slowly, the nod of a man revising a private ledger of his own, regarding what sort of person he was dealing with. Behind them, the wagon crew had begun to stir, boiling coffee over a low fire, and somewhere, a mule brayed at the cold, and the ordinariness of it struck her as strange against the size of what was being decided in the wash. She thought of her cousin's letter, folded now in her coat pocket, the offer to share what he called their claim, and she thought of the $25 counted out on a ledger 3 years before, and she found that neither memory carried the weight it once had. They were simply facts now, the way the 11 feet were a fact, the way the grade through the Narrows was a fact, whether or not any man in a fine coat wished to acknowledge it. The engineer asked what she wanted, and she answered without hesitation, because she had turned the answer over in her mind through 2 long nights on the trail, and arrived at it the way her father had taught her to arrive at any figure, not by wanting, but by measuring what the situation could reasonably bear. She did not ask for a fortune. She asked for the toll to be honored in perpetuity, recorded fresh, under the railroad's own seal, and she asked, almost as an afterthought, though it was not an afterthought at all, whether a company building through country like this might have use for someone who could already read its grades. He looked at her for a long moment, then at the level in her hands, and said he would need to speak with his superintendent, but that he did not think the answer would be no. He did not offer her a chair while she waited, but he did not ask her to leave the room either, and she understood that this small omission was itself a kind of answer, the way her father had once told her that the absence of an objection was worth more than the presence of a compliment. She stood near the window with the level still cradled against her ribs, watching the yard below, where men unloaded rail from flat cars, with the particular unhurried competence of people paid by the day rather than the task, and she let herself feel, for the first time since the crossing at the Narrows, something that was not quite triumph, but was close enough to it that she did not correct the feeling. The superintendent, when he came, was an older man with ink-stained fingers, and a manner that suggested he had long ago stopped being impressed by anything short of a working figure on a page. He did not ask her age. He did not ask about her father, though he glanced twice at the level's brass plate, as though the name engraved there meant something to him that he chose not to speak aloud. He asked instead about the drainage on the eastern approach, and whether the grade held past the second switchback in wet weather, and she answered each question the way she had been taught to answer them, plainly, with numbers instead of impressions, until the questions themselves seemed to run out of places to go. When the two men conferred by the far wall, their voices low, she did not strain to hear them, because she had learned somewhere in the last 10 years that a person waiting on a decision made by others gains nothing by trying to read it early. She thought instead of the wagon wedged in its rocks, and of the false floor that had held its secret through a decade of snow and thaw, and of the particular quiet of that canyon before she had ever set foot in it, a quiet that had not known, any more than she had, what it was keeping. The superintendent returned first. He said the company would honor the deed as recorded and would draw fresh papers under its own seal within the week. He said this in the flat tone of a man reading off a manifest, and she received it the same way, because she understood that this was how such matters were properly settled, without ceremony, without warmth, the way her father had always said the truest transactions were the ones nobody thought to celebrate. Then he asked, almost in passing, whether she might be free to start on Monday. She said she would need to know what the work required before she could answer, because she had learned that much too, from years of watching men agree to terms before they understood them and spend seasons afterward paying for that haste. The superintendent did not seem offended by the question. He said the spur would need a full survey of the grade through the pass before the first rail was laid, elevations checked against the old wagon route at every quarter mile, culverts sited where the spring runoff had always cut through, and someone on hand who understood the ground well enough to catch an error before it became a trestle built on the wrong shelf of rock. He said the company's own engineers were competent enough with a transit in open country, but the pass was not open country, and he had read her figures twice now and found them sound both times. He did not say this as praise. He said it the way her father used to note that a chain had been pulled taut and not left to sag, a simple statement of a thing done correctly, and she found she wanted no more than that from him. She told him Monday would answer, and that she would want it in writing, the wage and the duration and the scope of what was asked of her, because she had learned that a verbal understanding was worth exactly as much as the two memories that held it, and memories were cheaper than paper. He allowed that this was reasonable and said the clerk would draw it up before she left the building. Behind her, near the door, she was aware of her cousin still standing where he had been left, his hat now in both hands, his offer of partnership unanswered, and, she understood, unanswerable, because there was nothing left in the room to partner in. She did not look at him again. She thought instead of the level in its case at the boarding house, wrapped the same way it had always been wrapped, and of the particular satisfaction of knowing that the instrument had finally been put to the use her father intended for it all along, not to measure a road that already existed, but to prove one that the world had insisted did not. The paper came before noon, drawn up in a clerk's careful hand, and she read it twice the way her father had taught her to read any document with money attached to it, once for what it said, once for what it did not. It named a wage that would have seemed a fortune to the girl who had counted $25 into a coin purse on a cold morning years before, though she was careful not to let that arithmetic show on her face. It named a duration of 18 months, with provision for renewal, and it named the scope plainly: survey and certify the grade through the pass, consult on the siting of the depot, advise on the placement of the spur where it would meet the trunk line below. It did not name her cousin at all, and she noted that omission the way she noted the absence of a marker on an old road, not as an accident, but as a decision someone else had made and would now have to live inside. She signed it standing at the counter, because she did not trust chairs offered by men who had, until an hour before, intended to do without her entirely. The engineer signed beside her, and the clerk witnessed both signatures with the flat, unbothered competence of a man who had watched larger sums change hands over smaller matters and thought nothing of either. Outside, the light had shifted toward afternoon, the particular slant of it falling across the boardwalk in bars of gold and shadow, and she stood a moment letting it warm the back of her neck before she went to collect her satchel and the case that held the level. She did not go looking for her cousin. She did not need to. She understood, in the plain, unornamented way her father had taught her to understand a grade or a ledger, that the partnership he had offered was not an offer at all, but a hedge, made a quarter hour too late to matter, and that the only answer such a thing deserved was the one she had already given by walking past it. She rode back toward the pass that afternoon, with the contract folded inside her coat, and the level riding easy in its case behind the saddle, and she found, somewhere along the familiar grade, that she was already thinking not of what had been settled behind her, but of the stakes she would need to set the following morning, and where. The town, when it came, did not come quickly, and that too felt right to her, the way a grade takes its time revealing whether it will hold. Through that first autumn it was only a surveyor's camp and a supply tent and the wreck itself, still wedged between the rocks where it had waited a decade for someone patient enough to ask what it was for. By the following spring, there were 2 structures with real lumber walls, and by the spring after that, a third, and she watched it happen the way she had once watched a river cut a channel, slowly, according to laws that did not care whether anyone was impressed by them. She surveyed the spur herself, walking the grade in the gray hours before the work crews rose, setting her stakes with the same unhurried certainty her father had shown her, on a hillside she still remembered, by the particular gray of the sky that day. The chief engineer signed her contract without ceremony, the way a man signs a paper he has already decided is correct, and if there were others in the company who thought it irregular to pay a woman for such work, they kept the thought to themselves, having seen by then what her lines looked like against the land once the rail was actually laid upon them. She did not hear from her cousin again, not directly, though word reached her once, second-hand and unremarkable, that the company he'd sold his shares to had folded within 2 years, the way such companies often did when they were built on haste rather than measurement. She felt, on hearing it, neither triumph nor pity, only the small flat recognition of a fact confirmed, the same feeling she'd had reading a grade correctly. The town took a name eventually, practical and unpoetic, the kind of name that describes a place rather than praising it, and she stayed in it, because staying had become, without her quite deciding it, the truest shape her life had taken. She built her office at the mouth of the pass where the wreck had stood, and when the last of the old wagon's timbers were finally cleared away to make room for the platform, she kept one iron fitting from it on her desk, not as a relic of loss but as a plain reminder of where a thing had been found and what it had turned out to hold. Above the door, where anyone entering could see it, she mounted her father's brass level, not polished to a shine, but kept clean and true, the way he had always kept it, the way she meant to go on keeping it, for as long as there was ground left to measure, and a reason to measure it honestly.